You're listening to Kill Cliff's Hazard Ground podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's guest, as we go back to the Vietnam War to tell a very personal story from a man who went on to be an author of several books, but most notably his personal story in Vietnam. Our normal announcements that we always give you every week. Make sure you guys subscribe to our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast, at Hazard Ground. Look for us all over social media. Interact with us there. Please leave us messages. Tell us what you like about the show, what you don't like. We do our best to get back to everybody on social media as often as we can. So by all means, again, please hit us up on social media. Don't forget to also leave us Apple reviews. These continue to help us grow the show. Wherever you get your Apple podcasts, give us a 5-star rating. Tell us why you love the show. It does not have to be a lengthy review. Something very short, very simple, and why you love the show. That will help us grow this Hazard Ground community as we try to crack the top 100 Apple podcasts. We're moving our way up, but need your help to do it. And tell a friend. Tell a friend to also leave a review that you know about this podcast or that's a fan of this podcast. And certainly we appreciate you guys doing that. As always, our promotion with Amazon on our website, always a constant reminder there, because it's an easy way for you to help out veterans all across America just by going to hazardground.com. That's our website. And then you click on the Amazon button at the bottom of our homepage or into the sponsors tab, redirects you to Amazon. And once you get redirected to Amazon, you will be able to do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the great charities and organizations you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. So with all that out of the way, I want to remind you as well to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to download the Kill Cliff TV app, because those both places, our YouTube channel and Kill Cliff TV app, you can watch all of our Hazard Ground episodes. It's a great way just to see who the guests are and interact with us, and certainly a different way other than audio to be able to listen and watch the Hazard Ground. And then don't forget about killcliff.com. Get all of your clean energy drinks at Kill Cliff. All proceeds there benefit the Navy SEAL Foundation, started by a former Navy SEAL. If you're into CBD, they make a wonderful line of CBD products. I personally use Kill Cliff, the pre-workout, the post-workout. Those are my favorites. So by all means, use the killcliff.com to order all of your Kill Cliff. All right, let's get on to this week's episode with a man who enlisted at the Navy at 17 years old. He ended up just spending 4 years in the Navy and got out as an E5, a boatswain's mate, second class. But he had 2 tours in Vietnam, one of them which he was injured on a riverboat in Vietnam in 1968 during the bloodiest year of the war. His Vietnam memory stories, as he told them, evolved into a memoir, which he turned into a book called Muddy Jungle Rivers. It is the 10-year anniversary of that book, and Muddy Jungle Rivers was the 2017 Veterans Voice Award for the book that he wrote in Minnesota, where he is originally from. And we welcome on to the show Wendell Affield here on the Hazard Ground. Wendell, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mark.
Okay. I want to get to Muddy Jungle Rivers. Obviously, you went on to become an author, write several other books that are more historical narratives, but not necessarily military related. So we'll get to that coming up here in just a few moments. But at 17 years old, during the Vietnam War, you decide to enlist in the Navy. Why?
I did. Well, that's kind of a different childhood. In 1960, the summer of 1960, my mother was committed to a mental hospital, and we 9 children were placed in foster homes. And over the next 4 years, I bounced through 5 different foster homes. And the summer of 1964, I rode the rails and lived in hobo camps, and I met my first Vietnam veteran. Well, that fall, I came back to high school. I was in the 11th grade, and about November or so, I realized this just isn't doing it for me. So I dropped out of school and went up to the recruiter's office. Well, it's kind of a humorous story. We have a federal building here in Bemidji, Minnesota, and I went up to the 4th floor, knocked on a Marine recruiter's door, because the real men were Marines, right? So no answer. I went next door to the Navy recruiter's office and knocked, and a enlisted man let me in, probably a first class petty officer, I'm recalling. And I asked him where the Marine recruiter was, and he said, well, he's gone for the day. Why are you thinking of enlisting? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, just between you and me, the Marine Corps sucks. And here I was, a 17-year-old kid, fresh off the farm, still smelling the cow manure on my shoes, signing my papers for the Navy. A couple of weeks later, I was on a plane to San Diego with boot camp.
Now, were you mentally and physically prepared for boot camp at that point?
You know, as much as a 17-year-old farm kid from northern Minnesota can be, I loved the warm weather. I left in dead of winter, and well, it was early March actually. But I was just amazed at how warm it was, and I think I was better prepared than some of the recruits. Absolutely, psychologically, I did okay. You know, I had a very Spartan upbringing, so you know, I did okay. I have some memories from a few other recruits in our company that didn't do so well.
I mean, you had to know when you enlisted that you were going to end up in Vietnam at some point. That didn't phase you, that didn't deter you, obviously, in any way. I mean, what was the sort of thought process in that?
There really wasn't one. You know, I came into it. You have to understand, we lived in a very isolated existence. We didn't have a television, okay? And in our world up here, you know, among the old farmers, they were all World War II vets, a couple Korean vets who never talked about anything. But we grew up with the mindset that America was heroic. We were always right. And, you know, you listen to the old World War II, well, they weren't old then. They were younger than both of us, and in the early 50s. And you knew it was the right thing to do to go into the military. So it was a positive mindset.
All right. So how quickly after you finish basic training are you moving somewhere else? What's your first duty station? Where are you going, and that sort of deal?
I went directly from boot camp onto the USS Rogers, DD-876. It was a destroyer. It was home ported out of San Diego. So it was a pretty easy move. And they didn't send me to any schools out of boot camp. I went right to the deck force, which was where kind of a dumping station for a lot of recruits. But soon after I got on there, I enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the standing bridge watches and lookout watches, and I had a lot of freedom and, you know, to move around the ship. And before we went to our Vietnam deployment, I was sent to a pilot rescue class for swimmers. It was swimming survival pilot rescue. And I graduated from that. And I felt really good about that, because out of about 30 or 35 sailors that were in that class, there was only a few of us that actually completed it and graduated, because it was a very strenuous. We were spending about 12 to 14 hours a day in the water, and, you know, so a lot of it was survival. And then the second school they sent me to from the ship was a ship's landing force party, because I was being trained to be the coxswain on our motor whaleboat, as a motorized boat on the ship. And so we went to a Marine base in Camp Pendleton and spent, I forget, about 10 days there, as I recall, learning how to set up ambushes and fire a lot of different weapons that normally, you know, like the BAR was a big thing back then. And the M1s, it was before the M16s came around. But so I graduated from that, and it was kind of humorous, because a couple of years later, the purpose for the ship's landing force was when we went over to Gulf of Tonkin, one of our duties was to rescue downed pilots. And the purpose of the ship's landing force was to take the motor whaleboat into the coast of North Vietnam and go ashore to rescue downed pilots. And well, a couple of years later, when I was on a riverboat, I thought, what an insane idea. We would never gotten within 1,000 yards of the coast before we were blown out of the water. But anyway, so yeah, I enjoyed my time on the USS Rogers.
When do you get to your first deployment in Vietnam?
That was January 1966. We left San Diego. We went to Hawaii and we spent a couple days there. And I remember where we were, the Arizona was right behind us, and I was standing fantail watches because I was fresh recruit, and it's kind of hard to screw up what's going on behind you. And early in the morning, 5 in the morning or so, it's light, just dawn, and I could see these oil bubbles rising to the surface from the Arizona. And it just fascinated me because figuring 65, that was only 25 years past when it got sunk. But anyway, I was just talking to some friends that were over in Hawaii, and they said those oil bubbles are still coming up, after 75, 80 years after it was sunk.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's crazy. I wonder, you said you didn't have a TV and you weren't really cognizant of or aware of what was going on in Vietnam. At any point in time in the train up or when you get there, did the thought cross your mind? You're like, well, if I would have known this ahead of time, I wouldn't have signed up for this kind of deal.
No, that never crossed my mind. No, I was, first of all, on the ship, you didn't really feel threatened. One time when we were up in the Gulf, we went in near the coast to pick up downed pilots or bodies, and we got a few shells splashing around the ship that time. But that was the only time that we really had close incoming. We did a lot of shore bombardment and refueling at sea. And with the shore bombardment, 2 years later, when I was on a riverboat, we were on the Quaviet River, which is just south of the DMZ. And it was in the spring of 68. Quezon offensive was going on, and there was a lot of crap going on. But we were patrolling this river, just we were maybe a mile and a half or two in from, not even that, about a mile in from the actual coastline. And all of a sudden, one morning, we started getting friendly fire from a ship that was off the coast. And wow. Yeah, it was amazing. None of us got injured because they were airbursts right over our boat. And it just, yeah. And wow. There were some very heavy battles going on just on the north side of the river. Keith Nolan wrote a really, really powerful, detailed book about that. That's called, I believe, The Magnificent Bastards. And it's about the Marine battles on the north side of the Quaviet River that spring. But that's who they were. That's what the ship was firing in support of those battles. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So back to your first deployment. When do you get, or do you even get into combat during that first deployment?
I wouldn't, after being on a riverboat, it's
perspective, right?
Yeah, it's perspective. It truly is. Like I say, we had that one incident where we had a few incoming rounds. Other than that, we were off the coast firing fire support and H&I, harassment and eviction fire, I believe they call it. So I never really felt threatened at all.
Did you see any sort of, of the horrors of Vietnam in that first deployment?
That day that we got shelled, I saw basically the skull of the pilot that had crashed, and the ship took off before we could even retrieve that because we were getting incoming.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just, again, you just mentioned a moment ago about perspective. I'm just, we talk to so many people who have been on multiple deployments. It's like one thing to get somebody to go into combat once. It's tough to get them to go back, willfully after they've seen how bad it can be. And so after your first deployment to Vietnam, your first tour over there, you ended up having to go back for a second one. But before we get to the second one, when you were injured, what happened in between?
Well, what happened in between. I did see the results of some combat. When we were going home, we stopped in Yokosuka, Japan. There's a huge naval base there to offload all our ammunition. And I started getting this cramp in my side. And if you've ever been in a naval work detail offloading ammunition, it's like a 200-man chain carrying projectiles and power casing. I kept getting worse and worse, and I went to our corpsman on a ship, and he just told me I was skating and trying to get out of work. Well, I just got to the point where I could hardly walk, so I went to the supply ship doctor that we were hauling the ammo to, and they had an ambulance come and haul me to Yokosuka base hospital. Well, here my appendix had ruptured.
Oh, wow.
And so I had emergency surgery, and I had to get blood transfusions and stuff. But I ended up on a hospital ward with a bunch of Marines who had been in combat, and they were wounded naturally. Well, one day, General Westmoreland came walking the ward handing out Purple Hearts. And he got to me, and he just automatically set one on my bed. And I said, well, sir, I haven't earned that. Well, what are you here for? And I told him, and well, we'd love to have you in the Army. Thanks. I'll consider it.
That's great. Never stop recruiting, right? When you're a
they
commander,
never stop recruiting.
That's
funny. But eventually it was a really interesting time. I was in a transit barracks after I was discharged from the hospital, and that was a skating detail trying to get out of work. And sometimes we'd hide. They had these Yokosuka has these like mini mountains, giant hills, and during World War II, the Japanese had just honeycombed these hills, and sometimes we'd sneak into those tunnels to hide from working parties on the base. But anyway, so I eventually got flown back to San Diego and got on Rogers, and I was there just a few months and got transferred up to Bremerton, Washington, to a new construction, USS Samuel Gompers, which was a destroyer tender. And I was on there. I didn't like it. It was a big ship. There was too much military BS and stuff. And in those days, it was before cell phones, naturally. And I was standing on a pier waiting in line to use the telephone. And this third-class boatswain mate came off this little ship that was tied up right near us. And I'm looking at it, and he's right behind me in line, and we started visiting, and I commented what a cool-looking ship it was and stuff. And in visiting, he said, how would you like to get a transfer? He was newlywed, and his bride was in Seattle, and he wanted to stay ashore for a while. Well, I put in, and it wasn't unusual for guys of the same rate, and if you had approximately the same time in service or left in service, you could swap duty stations. And so we put in paperwork to swap duty stations, and it was denied because I didn't have a secret clearance. And I never really gave it much thought till much later. Well, the ship that I wanted to get onto was, what's the name? What's the one that North Koreans captured? Pueblo. That's the ship I was trying to get onto. And so that's why that guy had a secret clearance, I'm sure, because it was a communications ship. It was not a survey ship as they claimed it was. Right. But I was on there. So the reason I'm telling that story, so I went down in officers' country to do the paperwork and stuff. And when it was denied, I saw a notice on a bulletin board. They were looking for volunteers for riverboats. So that I did get approved. And a few months later, I was down in Coronado, California, part of the Mobile Riverine Force in training.
What was it about the riverboats that excited you?
At that point, it was to get the hell off the Samuel Gompers. But I as a young kid, figure I was 19 years old at that point, just turning 19. The excitement, and just getting out of the States, getting back to sea duty. Yeah.
When you end up back in Vietnam for your second tour, again, it's 1968, but where are you initially and sort of what is your mission?
Well, when we left the States, we left on January 30th of 1968. And if you recall your history, Tet Offensive was triggered just then. We landed, we flew up to Alaska, on to Kadena, I believe, Okinawa. And we ended up getting stuck there for 3 days because Tan Son Nhut, the big air base by Saigon, was closed down. We got to Tan Son Nhut and we couldn't get a ride down to the Delta to Dong Tam for about a week because everybody's busy. Everyone's busy. And so we spent a week. It was really humorous. And I wrote about it in my Muddy Jungle book. Here we were on the base. John Wayne's Green Berets had just come out. And here we were sitting in the base movie theater watching that movie. And there was literally, you talk about effects, you could literally feel outgoing artillery firing while we were watching the movie from Tan Son Nhut area. But we did get down to Dong Tam, which was kind of the home port, I guess you'd call it home port, where our riverboats were. And we were down there for a few days waiting for the boats to come in from the Tet operations. And yeah, eventually they did, and we took over and did a little bit of training with the old crew on the boat. And we were down in the Delta, pretty much running nonstop, as I recall, that first month. And in early March, Khe Sanh offensive was going strong, and they were having trouble keeping the Qua Viet River open for supplies. So they shipped our squadron, 1112 of the Mobile Riverine Force, up to Qua Viet. And we were up there from March till early July of 68. And what we learned is LSTs would come in and drop supplies at the Qua Viet Naval Base, and then LCM-8s would haul them upriver to Dong Ha. And from Dong Ha, they were choppered into Khe Sanh. That was one of the main supply routes from the way I understood. So we were up in Dong Ha, or rather in Khe Sanh. That's where we would go at night. We patrol the rivers during the day. Then at night we'd beach at Qua Viet and use the marine showers and a chow hall there sometimes. And when we were lucky, we could sneak onto a LST that was there later in the evening and eat and shower there. And boy, it was wonderful because mostly we eat sea rations on the boat. But go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to start to ask you to develop some of this, sort of day-to-day operational tempo, if you will, when you're in Khe Sanh, and obviously you're trying to protect the supply lines coming through and everything else. But is this one of these things where you are, seeing the enemy every single day, every other day? Like, kind of just give me some of that, the context there.
Okay. First of all, we weren't in Khe Sanh, we were in Qua Viet.
Qua Viet, okay.
Qua Viet, yeah. We never were actually up to Khe Sanh. Our daily routine would go something like this. Early in the morning, we'd have our morning sea ration chow and back into the river. I was a coxswain. I drove the boat, and our boat, so the audience understands, was a converted LCM-6. If you ever watched the movies, World War II movies like Saving Private Ryan, where they're hitting the beaches with those landing craft, that's exactly what our boats were. Okay. They retrofitted them with armor plating for World War II, or for Vietnam. We had 250 caliber turrets, port and starboard, above deck, and then we had a 20 millimeter cannon that was aft and above them. Down the well deck, we had 4 30 calibers. And our mission, when we started out, when Mobile Riverine Force was formed, was to haul Army troops around, because down in the Mekong Delta, there's very few roads. Water table is like 2 feet above, 2 feet below, ground level. But anyway, back to Qua Viet. So I'd back out into the river. We had a 7-man crew. Everybody would be on their duty stations in their turrets and whatnot. And mines were our biggest threat up on the river. They'd have all night. It was kind of a dumb thing in hindsight. The North Vietnamese, you didn't have Viet Cong up there. You had North Vietnamese. They had all night to set mines. Well, so we'd have sweep gear out and you'd go up the river, and it was about 8 miles maybe to Dong Ha, and you'd turn around and come back. But every day there was 10 of our boats, and every day you'd move forward 1 step. Okay, so every 5th day you were the lead boat, which was the most dangerous position. And we were up there maybe a week or 10 days, and I was second in the column, and the boat right in front of me, Tango 7, I was just maybe 50 yards behind it. All of a sudden the boat was out of the water and it flipped over, and 6 of the 7-man crew got killed. Well, after that, they had the crews, rather than be below deck, they had all the crew members stay topside on the inboard side of the boat from the riverbank.
Why was that?
Well, so if the one survivor was topside. So, and they had actually set that guideline before Tango 7 got mined, and whatever, the crew wasn't where they should have been. But it was kind of a lesson learned. It was a sad deal. One of the things that over the weeks we were up there, it got to be so boring. You asked about how often we saw enemies, NVA soldiers. I can't honestly say I ever actually saw one up there.
Really?
We never actually saw one. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was the first day that we were up there. The second day, first day we were up there, we had a guide on the boat showing us where to go and stuff. And the Quaviet River had a lot of sandbars on it, a lot of bends into other channels and stuff. And the tide had a huge impact on the depth of the river. Well, must have been the second day I was up there. I'm following the route I had gone earlier in the day, and all of a sudden I ran aground big time. And so was probably less than 10 minutes. We were waiting for another boat to come and pull us off. All of a sudden we started getting incoming mortar fire. So the North Vietnamese, they were watching us. We just couldn't see them.
As all this is going on, and the amount of, I guess just firefights that you're getting in, right? Or at least incoming fire that you're receiving at some point. None of this ever sort of triggers any sort of mental response in you to maybe I made a bad decision, or, I escaped this once, I don't think I'll escape it again type deal.
No, at that point, I don't recall. One of the big problems that we had at night at the base, the naval base at Quaviet, was incoming artillery. A few times I got caught ashore, and in the book, I write one incident where I was drunker than a skunk, actually. I had pulled a decomposing body out of the river, and I was just, part of his flesh fell into my face and my mouth and stuff when I rolled him onto the boat. But I went to the beer hooch and just was trying to drown the taste and whatever. But we started getting incoming, and I was just totally schnockered, and everybody else took off for the bunkers, and I'm just thinking, hell with it, whatever. What difference does it make, as Hillary would say? But eventually,
that in there.
Had to get that in there. But eventually I decided around, as I recall, hit near the beer hooch, and some shrapnel ripped into the steel roof, and I thought, I better go find a bunker. So I'm heading towards one, and a round hit in front of me, and I jumped into the hole it made. I didn't get wounded or anything. But after that, I thought, I realized, that this was a pretty high risk. That was probably the most high risk time when I was up there, when we were ashore at night. Yeah. I have a friend that attends a writing group that I facilitate here in Bemidji, and a veterans writing group. And he was a POW down in South Vietnam for a little over 4 years. And he talks about, B-52 strikes, how down in their holes in their bunkers, how they'd be laying there hugging the earth, and it just lift them right off the ground. And I thought, I can kind of relate to that in a tiny way compared to the experience he went through. But
So let's get to the 7-man crew that you were a part of. That ends up where you end up being injured, and what happens on the events of that day.
Well, our 7-man crew, let me talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Our boat captain was a lifer. He was a career man, and I don't mean to speak badly of him. I think at that time he was already an alcoholic. Okay. He did a good job when we were in the crap, but in between there were so many, and I think it's like so much of combat. When 99% of the time you're bored, or 95% of the time you're bored, it's the other 1 to 5% that you're terrified. And during all those down hours, our boat captain, his nickname was Buddha Ed Thomas. And he did a lot of drinking. Let's leave it at that. So we had him, we had our engine man, nicknamed Snipe, Brian College. I actually visited him a couple of years ago out in Pennsylvania. We're in touch. And he took care of the engines and engine compartment, anything electrical on the boat. We had our radio man, nicknamed Professor. Mentor was his last name, and I've never been able to find him. Brian and I have looked for him. We can't find him. But he was a college graduate, and he was very anti-war. And in my book, when I wrote my book, I didn't want to make it pro-war. Okay, I studied a lot of World War I poets, Sassoon and Graves and Owen, and I liked the way that they presented the loss and waste of war. And that's how I wanted my book to be. Anyway, I used Professor's character to portray the other side of the Vietnam experience. So we had him. He did a really excellent job. Dennis Page was one of the 50 caliber gunners. We had a other 50 caliber gunner named Crockett. He passed away from Agent Orange. And then we had our 20 millimeter cannon gunner named Emmons. And he was a black guy, and he did a really super job. And I remember Martin Luther King was assassinated while we were up north. And in my book, I explored that experience and how the 20 gunner reacted to it. And I think I'm fairly accurate. If you look at my Amazon reviews, almost all the riverboat guys comment how accurate my memories are, except for a couple, but whatever. But anyway, so we were up north till
What
July.
was your nickname, by the way? Everybody else had a nickname. What was yours?
Eighth.
Okay.
Eighth.
Got it.
Oh, tell you a quick story about how Buddha got his name. One of the other riverboat captains, Jimmy Austin, just a really neat guy. He passed away from Agent Orange. But one night we were sitting in an EM club in Vallejo, California, during our training. And Buddha was a really big guy. And he, like I say, he loved his juice. And all the boat captains were sitting at this table shooting a breeze. And Jimmy looked over at Buddha and he says, you remind me of a Buddha I seen once up in Kyoto, Japan. And Ed Thomas, our boat captain, he thought that was the coolest thing. And that became his nickname, Buddha. He started signing things, Buddha Ed Thomas.
That's great.
Anyway, that's how he got his name. So what was your question?
No, that was how you got what your nickname was, because you
just
gave everybody a nickname.
Yeah.
But just
I didn't hang the nicknames. Buddha hung the nicknames. When the crews were first introduced to the boat captain, he pretty much hung nicknames on everyone.
Gotcha.
That wasn't my doing. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So all right. So you have the 7-man boat crew, and you guys are you're on the river. Take me through it.
Okay. When we're back down or still up north?
When you guys got injured.
Okay. So we went back down. Caisson ended in July. We went back down to the Delta on a LSD, landing ship dock. And in late July, we went on this operation down into the Yumin forest. And that was like an 8-day operation. Was really rare. It was interesting because we were the first Caucasians and Black people that these villagers had ever seen down there. No, there hadn't been any foreigners down in the Yumin since the French left in 1954. So we were really something. But that was an amazing operation because, as I recall, there were actually no Army casualties. They found a lot of supplies. They did a lot of damage to the Viet Cong. There is a picture in my book where they brought us. This is the only close-up VC I ever saw. They brought us a prisoner to be transported to the interrogation barge, and we hauled him on our boat, and there's a picture of him in a boat. But anyway, so we returned back to Mekong River, and on August 18th, a few weeks after Yumin, on August 18th, we went out on an operation. We had a full platoon of Army troops on our boat from the 2nd Brigade. And we end up going up this little Kai Bay Canal. And we were mid-column of about 8 boats or whatever. And all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. I turned the boat. One of the things, what our protocol was, in an ambush, you turn into the riverbank and drop the troops right into the ambush. So there was a machine gun bunker right into the bank. So I turned and I rammed it with the bow of the boat, and I went to drop the ramp, and it didn't go down. And there was a safety latch, and to this day I don't know what happened, why it didn't go down, because I had the control lever. Well, I pushed it forward and didn't. But anyway, we at that point started taking but 57 recoilless rounds and B-40s, which are armor penetrating, armor piercing rockets, the B-40s. And we took 2 57 recoilless rounds in the awning over the well deck of our boat. And that shrapnel just pretty much incapacitated the whole platoon of Army troops. And so a sergeant yelled up to me from the well deck. He says, just back off, because everybody was pretty screwed up. So I went to back off, and we took another 57 recoilless round right in front of my coxswain flat, right outside my 1-inch armor plating. And that kind of sent me flying the first time. And so I got backed off, and then we took a couple more B-40s. I took one on the port side of the coxswain flat, and it knocked my bar armor aside, ripped that out. And then the second one, they were pretty good shots, I'll say. It burned through the armor plating, and that's what I got hit with. It wounded me and the radio man, and I got knocked down, stunned and whatnot for a bit. But I got back up, and the radio was blaring at me, turn around. Well, the boat had turned around, and it was going back down river right into the other boats. So I got it turned around, and we started heading back up river. And a couple more B-40s hit us. One burned through one of the 50 caliber turrets and wounded the gunner, and he got severely maimed. So yeah, it was, eventually we got out of the kill zone.
I mean, you did everything by the book as far as follow the tactics and, techniques that you were supposed to do when given, and yet you sustained so many casualties. Do you feel in retrospect that you handled yourself the right way?
I think people in combat, you react. I get frustrated when I hear some of this business nowadays. Why didn't law enforcement officers do something else? When you're in a critical situation, you react. You don't have time to think things through and make decisions. In hindsight, yes, I think we did everything that we could have done. Yeah.
So what is the status of everybody? I mean, do you have a second to take inventory of where everybody is? You get out of the kill zone, but I mean, is almost all of your crew wounded or dead at this point?
No, actually. Buddha Ed Thomas, the boat captain, he was topside actually, and he would scrunch down between the gun turrets. I don't know if he was actually picked up any shrapnel, because I mean, when rockets detonate, there's shrapnel flying everywhere. You know that. But Dennis Page, one of our 50 caliber gunners, he got wounded in the legs from the same rocket that got me. Or it was from the one that burned through the other 50. I'm not sure. The 20 millimeter cannon gunner, he picked up a little shrapnel in his legs. The radioman got hit with some shrapnel. The engine man down below, I don't recall. I don't think he was wounded at all because he was below deck. But Dennis, the 50 caliber gunner, after I was wounded, radioman bandaged me up. Mostly, I got kind of just sprayed with shrapnel all over, nothing really critical. My hand got it the worst because when the rocket burned through, it missed my hand by about 2 inches or so. So it kind of shredded the top of that. And the radioman bandaged that up, and Dennis was on deck behind, so I had the radioman take over the helm, and I got down and bandaged Dennis's legs up a little bit, as I recall. But we didn't have any critical injured. Once we got out of the kill zone, then the Buddha, the boat captain, told me to go below because my face was kind of burned and stuff. And so I went down into the well deck, and that was just a total nightmare.
Why?
Well, because they had taken those rockets right on top of them. They did lose a guy, Hector Lugo Moica. He was a Puerto Rican. He was killed, and the Army gunner that was actually on one of our 50s had gotten hit with a B-40. He was severely maimed. And there were a lot of the Army guys were laying in our coat on our bunks because we lived on the boats. We had our bunks there. But yeah, the Army guys, most of them were really screwed up.
That's yeah. I mean, when do you get a chance to sort of, take stock and inventory and all that? I mean, you get out of the kill zone, where do you guys head to?
Well, there's nowhere. You just keep going up the canal. I was medevac. I got some of our boats. I think in the column that was there, we had one of our boats had a little helicopter pad on it. And so it came in and medevac a lot of the wounded, the more critical. And I don't remember how, I was probably the 5th or 6th flight off of there. I don't recall, but it was, so I didn't see a lot. When I left the boat, Buddha told me we got out of the kill zone and we went upriver a few hundred meters, and some of the Army troops that could still navigate got off the boat, and they were driven back on because of heavy fire. So we moved further up the river, and it seemed pretty safe then. And so Buddha told me to go next door. Oh, back up a second. We had these little motorized motor whaleboats, they call them, to haul wounded and to transport Army troops. And they were hauling some of the wounded on that, and snipers started taking the the injured out from that little boat. So Buddha told me to crawl on the riverbank. And so I did that because the medevac boat was just about 50 yards up from us. And so I crawled the riverbank to do that. And that's, yeah, I was wounded. I had a shotgun with me and I was crawling along, and a Viet Cong or whatever popped out of a spider hole and had a B-40 or a 57 recoilless rocket. He was going to shoot at a helicopter, and I ended up having to take him out. But anyway, I got to the riverboat and I was medevaced off that little platform back out. We had a hospital ship back out in the Mekong River. Mm-hmm. So I was flown out there.
I assume you have shrapnel all over your body at this point, in various places, but when do you wake up next? I mean, I'm sure did they have to do surgery on you? Did they have to put you under or did you just pass out from exhaustion and that was it?
I was not critically wounded. I had, hundreds and hundreds of little bits of shrapnel in me and a couple of pieces in my leg. And like I say, my hand was the worst. But I never passed out or anything like that. I could walk. We got back to the Colleton. That was the name of the ship that I got taken to with the medevac helicopter. And there were so many critical ahead of me. That day, I got an after action report years later, and that in that ambush, they record that 82 were wounded and 5 were KIA that day in that ambush. So wow. There were a lot of guys that were in much, much tougher shape than I was on the Colleton that needed emergency surgery. And they eventually just gave me a little shot and put me in a bed. And late that night, I ended up waking up on the operating table. Yeah.
Oh, what were they operating on?
My hand. It was kind of weird because they gave me a spinal in the back, in my neck. So they didn't actually put me to sleep. And I woke up, I was totally fatigued, exhausted, but I literally turned my head and my hand was out on the operating table and I could literally see them. They had my hand all opened up and they were picking bits of metal out, and my watch, part of the glass face or plastic face of the watch was actually buried in my wrist and stuff.
Oh, wow.
But I was so very, very, very fortunate. Usually when a B-40 came into a coxswain flat like that, the coxswain was almost always killed. It was so amazing when you reflect on it. That thing had to have come in at an angle and it just literally ricocheted right around us, the shrapnel, and naturally you get clipped with some of it. But yeah, probably today, the worst repercussions from it is my eyes were badly burned from the third rocket. I had my face.
I was going to ask you, with that explosion so close, you weren't burned anywhere?
Well, oh yeah. I had my face right up. We had 1-inch armor plating, and then offset about 1.5 feet or 2 feet, whatever, was bar armor. And you see a lot of bar armor on vehicles, on military vehicles today. I think maybe we were some of the first units that used bar armor, designed to detonate rockets before they hit the armor plating. Right. But anyway, so I had my face right up against the 1-inch slits in my armor plating, and trying to see how bad the damage was up in the well deck when that third rocket hit right below where my face was, and that flash burned my eyes pretty bad. I didn't realize it until a couple days later when they started scabbing up and stuff. And I tell that story in the book. It was pretty terrifying because they bandaged them up then, and I was literally blind for about a week, and it was scared the crap out of me.
Did you think you were never going to see again?
At that time, I didn't know, and the doctors didn't know. And the other thing was the concussion from that rocket that penetrated. I had blood running out of both ears. And to this day, in a quiet environment, I can actually hear pretty good. wearing these headphones, I can hear you just fine. But, and it's common for so many veterans and people that have been around loud noises. You get tinnitus, the ringing in your ears, the sounds, the noises. And when there's background noise, everything is just so garbled.
Guilty. I'm with you.
Yeah.
But the government's like, hey, thanks. We appreciate your hearing. You're not gonna get it back, but we apprite it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when are you officially medevaced out of Vietnam?
Well, I spent about 24 hours on the Carlton, the hospital ship that was in the Mekong.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took a medevac chopper up to Tan Son Nhut, and I was it was third surgical hospital. I was there for 2 days, maybe. Again, I talk about it in the book. And then I flew out to Japan. I was in the 6th Army. I was in an Army hospital in Tachikawa, Japan. And I was there for about 8 days. Yeah, about 8 days. And I flew back to the States we landed at Glenview Naval Air Station, just north of Chicago on August 29th, 1968. And that story I tell in the book. Back up just for a moment to when I was in the hospital in Japan. So my eyes were bandaged, and each day they'd clean my hands and pick shrapnel out of my leg and whatnot. And maybe 4 days or so after I got to Japan, they took the bandages off my eyes, and amazingly, I wear glasses, but my vision is pretty darn good. Well, I could hobble around, and one of the guys, Mays was his name, he had lost a foot, the same ambush that I was in, and he wanted some cigarettes, so I hobbled around, rounded up some cigarettes for him. But right across from where we were, the ward that we were in was a burn ward, and I peeked into it, and boy, you talk about the horrors of war, and today we see it, and it just makes you sick. But there was this burn ward, and I never will forget it, and the smell that was in there. These guys just wrapped like mummies, and as I recall, they were literally like strapped in cages so their bodies wouldn't be in contact with sheets or anything, because they had bare flesh and whatnot. But I always think to myself, politicians that are so pro-war and whatnot, they need to walk into a ward like that and see what they're setting young people up for.
Yeah. Was there any part of you that didn't want to leave Vietnam? You wanted to stay and finish it out?
I had a lot of guilt about leaving, because like I say, I there were so many people that were hurt much, much worse than I was. And I thought, when I was in Japan, I thought, man, I could go back to the riverboat. But in talking to Mays, this guy that I got cigarettes for, we were talking about going back. He had lost a foot, so he obviously wasn't. But he said, and by that time in August of 68, they already had the Vietnamization program on track for the Vietnamese to take over the American assets. And so there were so many, like Mays told me, he says there's so many sailors in the pipeline being trained right now. He says, you're not going back. And he was right. I ended up we landed in Glenview Naval Air Station and got shipped up to Great Lakes Naval Hospital, just south of Waukegan, north of Waukegan. But
go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to talk a moment about when we landed in Glenview on August 29th, 1968. So they loaded us. We had a regular convoy. It was a C-141. That's the giant planes. Okay. They loaded us onto hospital buses, and the more critical wounded they put on ambulances and whatnot. So we had a regular convoy that was leaving the base, and we got off the base, and all of a sudden we got surrounded and attacked by a mob of protesters, anti-war protesters. And if there was anything that bothered me for many, many years afterward, then the convoy just slowly eased through them. We didn't get beat up or anything like that. But for so many years, if anything bothered me, I think that was one of the bigger things. Why these anti-war protesters would want to assault already wounded troops. It just didn't make sense. And in 2007, I believe it was, I was taking a summer writing class, and I submitted an essay about that experience. And the professor, Steve Almond, he taught at Boston College. He was a visiting professor here in Bemidji that summer. And he said, this isn't true. This couldn't have happened. He says, my parents were protesters, anti-war protesters. They were nonviolent. And I said, no, this is what happened. Well, anyway, after that class, it really bothered me that here's this college professor teaching revisionist history. And so I drove down to Chicago and revisited Glenview, and I had called ahead, and I first went to the library, and the lady gave me a newspaper from August 29th, 1968. Well, I don't know why for 30 years I never put it together. On the 28th of August, if you recall your history, the 28th of August was the most violent protests and riots of the Democratic Convention down in Chicago. And Mayor Daley had requested the military send in troops as backup. And here in this newspaper article, it talked about, I think it was 3,000 Army troops had landed at Glenview Naval Air Station. Well, these protesters were very well organized. That's why they were out there trying to stop our convoy. They just assumed we were reinforcements heading down into Chicago, because the protests were still going on in Grant Park and whatnot. But I ended up writing an article about that. It was actually published in a Vietnam magazine titled Collateral Damage. It's on the HistoryNet. And I sent the article to Steve Almond, the professor, and he's a super guy. He acknowledged, what I found was true. And he ended up doing an edit and wrote the foreword for my Muddy Jungle River book. So,
oh, that was nice of him.
Yeah. I give him a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people wouldn't eat that much crow and have the ability to be as humble as that, and definitely a ton of credit. So since you mentioned it, when do you decide to start writing these memoirs of everything that you had gone through?
About 2000.
Really, you'd waited that long?
Oh yeah. When I got discharged in February of 69, I needed a job. Okay, I needed a job. And so I had two older brothers living down in the Chicago area, so I thought, I'm not going back to the farm. So I started looking around, and I applied for a job as a meat cutter apprentice because I knew how to butcher, having butchered on the farm when I was a kid. Well, I got hired by Jewel Foods down there, and ended up 30 years in the food industry, running butcher shops and whatnot. But the reason I mention that story is because in the late 90s, in 1980, we transferred. My wife and I moved back to northern Minnesota here, and I was managing a butcher shop, Lucan's Village Foods, here in Bemidji. And these old World War II vets would come in shopping, and they knew a bit about my Vietnam experience. And in the old days, in the early 50s, when they'd get together, they'd laugh and joke about, the old humor and uniform cartoons you see. Well, back in the early 50s, all they did is tell funny stories about their time in the military. Well, fast forward, almost 50 years, 60 years, all of a sudden, they don't remember the humor. And during the time that I was running a butcher shop there, I was always out in front helping customers and whatnot. And these World War II vets had come in, and over the years, it wasn't a lot of them, 3 or 4, but they'd start telling me a trauma story about when they were in World War II, maybe getting wounded or losing a friend, getting captured, whatever. And they'd start telling me the story. All of a sudden they'd tear up and get choked up and just walk away shaking their head. And their stories went to their grave with them. And many years later, after I started going to college, after I retired, I came to realize a couple of things. These old guys, very possibly, it was the anniversary date that they came to tell me their story. And it was very possibly the first time they had ever shared their story with anyone.
Yeah.
And so I thought, if I don't tell my stories, they're going to die with me too. And so I retired in 2001, started taking mostly writing classes. I just went part-time to Bemidji State University. And I was really fortunate. The professors empathized with me telling my stories. And I just started out writing memory stories. And for 10 years, I did that. And just writing literally memory stories. I didn't do it chronologically. I didn't make a timeline. I just started telling stories of my time on a riverboat and what I remembered. And at some point, quite a few years into the experience, a grad student suggested putting them chronological. And I did that. And it was quite an amazing revelation, because putting them chronological, it started making more sense. The experience started making more sense to me.
Sure.
And professors started encouraging me to make it into a book. And 10 years ago, there it was.
And Muddy Jungle Rivers is there. Now, in the 90s, you had been diagnosed with PTSD. It's something you speak on often now.
Correct.
What does it mean to you to have PTSD, and what do you tell people about it?
In the early 90s, I got noticed. I was in the VA system from 1969, because they sent me from Great Lakes Naval Hospital to the VA in Chicago. And so I healed up and whatnot, and I never went to a VA hospital for a few decades, actually. And in the early 90s, I got a notice to come in. They were doing an Agent Orange registry. And so by then we were back in Minnesota. I went over to Fargo, North Dakota VA hospital, and I'm visiting with this young doctor, and he was shocked to see that I was in the system, and he asked me why. And I says, well, I was in the hospital in 1969 in Chicago. And he says, well, what happened? And I just told him I was wounded in Vietnam. And he says, well, what happened? So he wanted to know the details. And so I started explaining the ambush to him, and I was just kind of shocked. I just started getting choked up and teary-eyed and stuff. And he says, have you ever been examined for PTSD? What's that? I had never heard of it before. And so, he set me up with a interview, and here I am now, trying to help others.
Yeah. And it's amazing that you are. I just, there are so many from your generation who those four letters weren't part of the lexicon for your generation.
No,
they're commonplace for veterans of my generation and guys like me. How much more do you find talking to fellow Vietnam vets is more, I don't want to say relatable when it comes to PTSD, but there's a different level of connection with Vietnam vets than there is other, post 9/11 vets?
There's a huge difference. I haven't really visited, where I live in this little community that we have, there's like 4 veterans in our little subdivision, our little development. And a couple of them are like your age or younger. And I invited them several years ago after my Muddy Jungle book was published. Our VA doc, Peterson, invited me to facilitate a veterans writer group at the VA clinic. Well, since COVID, we go to the Armory now. But anyway, so all Vietnam veterans joined it. And I invited these younger guys, Desert Storm, Desert Shield guys, to join our group. And nah. And then one guy, he says, I get together with my buddies once, a couple times a month or whatever, and we sit around and have a few beers and the bonfire. And he says, we're good. And I could so much relate to that, because that's how we were back in the 70s.
Right.
We didn't want to get involved in things. So yeah. But so in our group today, it's pretty much all Vietnam veterans. And with our writing, I use two books. I'll promote this. Writing War, you can't see it, it's backwards. Anyway, Writing War by Ron Capps. And you might be familiar with him. He has a veterans writer program, and it's a wonderful book full of prompts and why we write and whatnot. And so that's part of our curricula for our writer group. The other thing that we're just working on right now, it's called the Post-Traumatic Growth Workbook. A couple of years ago, I was invited to speak at this vet center mental health group and therapists out at the VA hospital in Fargo. And I asked the group, how many of you incorporate the concept, the theory of post-traumatic growth into your therapy for your patients? Not one of them. I don't know if they were condescending because I'm not a mental health professional or what, but I was just shocked, and so often when I ask people, are you familiar with post-traumatic growth? No one has ever heard that concept. And it's just amazing to me. And there's so many, again, I'll mention my friend that was a POW for 4 years, and there's so many like him, veterans that they were injured or they had severe trauma, but they've moved beyond that and they've done so much with their life. And that's basically what post-traumatic growth is all about.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I talk to people about it, and there's the common thing they're afraid to do is put the D on the end of PTSD, right? Well, we don't want to call it a disease or disorder or disease or whatever because of the connotation that comes with that. I mean, call it whatever you want. I don't know that it matters. We all know if you're dealing with it, we all know what it is and the problems and issues that it can cause. But again, if you want to focus on things like the remedy of post-traumatic growth, that's probably a more positive conversation than whatever label you want to give to the stressors that combat has left us all with.
Yes, very much so. Well said. Well said. Yeah, one of the things when probably about 2015, I was invited to do a presentation down in Minneapolis, St. Paul, about my writing experience in PTSD. And that's when I first came across the term post-traumatic growth. But I've come to realize, and I found this book, Writing to Heal. I don't have it in front of me. Not Pennebaker. Anyway, Writing to Heal is the name of the book. And I started reading it and I thought, this is exactly what I was doing for 10 years, taking writing classes at BSU. Is in writing my experiences, I was framing them. And each time you take a trauma experience and you put it down on paper, you're putting borders on it, and you can start exploring it and rearranging some of the. I always compare a trauma experience as like a video clip bouncing around in your head. Okay. Mm-hmm. And each time you think about it, it's a little bit different, but you can never really make sense of it. But if you put it down on paper, you take ownership of it for starters. And you can start. One of the things in my writing classes that I do, my writing workshops, I have what I have in the writing exercises. I have what I call an outer story. It's a journalistic, the who, what, when, why, where. Okay, those are pretty safe things to write about. And so I'll have the participants write a paragraph or two using that criteria. But then I get to what I call an inner story, your senses, what did you hear? What did you see? If you ate, what did you taste? Sometimes in writing, someone will write about how they could taste the cordite. Well, you don't actually taste it, but it's such powerful senses. And when you start writing about the senses, then it becomes personal because no one else can share what you as an individual experience. And that's when a lot of times people will find some meaning to what they experienced, or find some resolution or whatever to their traumas. One of the huge things that so many veterans struggle with is survivor guilt. And I think that's what I was dealing with when I was even back in the hospital in Japan. Is why don't I go back to the boat? But 50 years later, you come to realize I had no reason to feel guilty. There was,
Right.
it wasn't realistic for me to go back.
Mental health and post-traumatic stress are sort of themes throughout some of your other books, because you have 4 of them total now, correct? And
Correct.
I mean, that's, what's the connective tissue between all that? How does it all come together? Because you're a nonfiction writer. So these things are all based, at least in some measure, of truth. It's a tough subject to write on, because usually it's personal, right?
It is, until I've done so much research over the past decade and a half. You get to a point where it's not so personal anymore. It's more objective rather than subjective. Just a tiny bit of background. I was born in New York City. I never knew who my father was. My mother put an ad in, it's called, the title of the thing is Cupid's Columns. It was a Lonely Hearts Club newspaper. Okay, so here she was, basically homeless in New York City in 1949 with 4 little kids. And she put this ad in the paper, and Herman Affield in Nebish, Minnesota, north of Bemidji, 35-year-old bachelor farmer, answered the ad. Well, no, he was 43 then, actually. And she was about, she'd have been 28 by then. So there was about a 15-year age difference. Anyway, he answered the ad, and we disappeared from New York City. My grandparents lived in New York, and my grandmother was threatening to have my mother committed to a mental hospital. And so that was kind of one of her motives for getting the hell out of town. Anyway, we moved to Nebish, Minnesota. And that's basically where I grew up. Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's
but fast forward, I mentioned earlier that my mother was in fact committed about a decade after she moved here, and we were in foster homes and whatnot. Well, she died in 2010, and locked in the chicken house on our old farm where she spent her last 60 years, I discovered 200 years of our family history, maternal family history. And some of my siblings wanted to burn it, because at first glance, it looked like just a pile of junk. And I started digging through it. And my sister Laurel and I started digging through it. And what we found was just incredible. The earliest letter I found was from a David Olmsted. He had marched. I did a lot of research, like I said. I learned that he had marched with Washington in the Hudson River campaigns. Well, anyway, my grandmother, I had thousands, all this stuff got there. When my grandmother died in 1984, my mother inherited it all, and it was shipped from Seattle, Washington, and she literally locked it in the chicken house, never visited it, never would let any of us kids look at it. But there was thousands of letters that my grandmother, or hundreds of letters my grandmother had written. And in some of the letters, she references my mother being schizophrenic. Okay. I actually have 2 letters drafts. One she wrote to Governor Dewey of New York, and one she wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt. Please help me find my schizophrenic daughter and her 4 children, because that was in 49 and 50 after we disappeared. So I started studying schizophrenia, because I knew at some point I was going to tell my mother's story. And I thought, to deal with it, I need to understand schizophrenia. So I started really studying it. And the term borderline personality disorder kept popping up. And when my wife Patty and I were flying down to Tucson to visit our daughter several years ago, and in the airport in Minneapolis, St. Paul, here I discovered this little book Borderline Personality Disorder Demystified by Robert O. Friedel. And I bought it and I started reading it. And by the time we landed in Phoenix a few hours later, margins were scribbled up and sentences were underlined. Friedel's symptoms of borderline fit my mother just to a T, just fit her perfectly. And so since then, I've studied it a tremendous amount, and I'm 100% confident that that's what she would have been diagnosed with today. But back in the 60s, it was actually, borderline was recognized the same year PTSD was, in 1980 or 82, whenever. Yeah. So in my writing, and one of the things anyone that does any history, any research for family writing, boy, I encourage them to get the military records of their veteran ancestors. I got my stepfather's records, and I learned that he was in North Africa. Well, for some reason, okay, and I got the information how he was sent to the back. He had they call it shell shock. He had a breakdown, and he got shipped back to the States early. So I had that information, so much detailed information I had from him and from my grandfather and from eventually my biological father. In 2014, my sister and I did DNA tests. Mm-hmm. And my sister, what we learned from my two older brothers and my sister and myself, the kids that my mother brought to the farm, we had between us, there were 3 fathers involved. Well, we knew, yeah. See, and that goes directly to a borderline. That goes directly to a borderline diagnosis. Fear of abandonment, fear of being alone, being impulsive. You're lonely. A guy comes along. What do? You know? So anyway, in 2017, my sister Laurel got a call from a guy, David, in Cincinnati, Ohio, who discovered my sister's sibling. And we went down there. It just so happened I was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at a USS Rogers reunion in Chattanooga. And so I took a little detour, went to Cincinnati, met Laurel's new family, and I met the man, David, who had discovered Laurel's father. And when he learned that I didn't know who mine was, he's a retired genetics scientist. What's the odds of in the whole world finding a person like that connecting? He started searching for my father. And 2 years later, in October of 2019, he made the connections. And it was, there's a link for a TV interview that we did together, one of my newfound brothers, myself. And it was just such an amazing experience. I reached out to my one brother, Louis Rion, lives in Montauk, New York. We went and spent a week out there with him, and it was he and his wife Patty, and it was so amazing to meet all of my new siblings. Yeah, just so
that's incredible. There's silver lining, right? I mean, after all that, no one could have written that story down and made it make any sense. But you and your siblings are living it, so that's incredible. Again, it's the 10-year anniversary of Muddy Jungle Rivers. You can get it on Wendell's website, wendellaffield.com, WendellAffield. So Affield with 2 F's, Wendell as it sounds, wendellaffield.com, as well as all of your other books, again, that are, historical nonfiction, so to speak, but personal stories to you and your family. So congratulations on the success of Muddy Jungle River. Obviously, it's also available on Amazon, anywhere else you get books. But the reviews of it are just lauded with the realism and certainly the authenticity of what it takes or what had happened to you and what you survived in Vietnam. And it's a testament that you're still here and that you are still telling these stories. And as you said, keeping a lot of memories alive.
Mark, thank you. It's been a pleasure visiting with you.
Wendell Affield, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Take care.
Hosted by Mark Zeno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Are we still connected? Thank you.